Hello, everybody. My name's Tom Gray. I'm the CTO at BP Launchpad. You may know my dulcet tones from the Frankly podcast series. Now you get to see my equally dulcet face. Today we're doing something a little bit different. I'm really proud to host you here on this webinar in the Launchpad networking series. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the evolution of the smart grid. Before I do that, if you want to learn a little bit more about BP Launchpad and what we do, please do check out our website, bplaunchpad.com. There you can find previous episodes of this webinar on a whole variety of interesting topics, but also you can find the Frankly podcasts where we talk to founders and we talk to technologists about kind of current topics in the energy sector as well. Just to give you a little bit of a sense, if you're new to BP Launchpad is the scale-up factory in BP. Our job is to work with early stage businesses to drive scale by injecting capital, but also bringing the best of BP in terms of access to markets, access to resources, access to expertise. Everything we can do to make businesses scale faster in the clean tech sector. So there's a bit about BP and BP Launchpad. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolution of the smart grid. I was reflecting the other day that the energy network is just actually an incredible piece of engineering. You know, to rival the internet in many ways, an engineering that actually is all around us. You know, and somebody was saying, I was reading somewhere that actually what's really interesting about the electricity network is, of course, it's developed in the open in many ways. You know, we see the infrastructure of that network all around us. And actually, you know, as consumers, we expect that network to just work. We expect it to be on at all times. We expect it to be at a solid 50 hertz, if you're here in the UK, constantly running, irrespective of how much demand we put on it. As consumers, we expect to plug in. If we want electricity, we get more electricity. We keep plugging stuff in, and more, if you're anything like me, you're going to be plugging in more and more stuff. I don't know about everybody else, but I find I'm always buying extension cables to plug in more things into the electricity network. So more and more people putting more and more demand on that electricity network. And yet actually, of course, we're at a really interesting phase, a really interesting turning point in the evolution of that network, because the other trend, of course, that we see in the industry is this trend towards electrification. As people seek to move to more and more renewable resources, more and more electricity is being used as the delivery vector, I guess, for bringing that energy into people's lives and into people's homes. More and more people are being encouraged to buy electric cars, gigantic batteries on wheels that they expect to be able to charge up and rapid and supercharge pretty much overnight. So taking something that was an amazing piece of engineering that's been around for a long time, adding more and more people and more demand on it, and then simultaneously also adding this step change in demand as we move to electrification. It's actually an incredible feat of engineering to keep that running. And of course, what you really need to be able to keep that running is a nice, stable, secure supply, which is, of course, exactly what's not happening right now. Because at the same time as we're moving to things like electric vehicles, on the other end of the network, we're also moving away from potentially polluting, but nonetheless very predictable sources of energy. And we're moving to much cleaner sources of energy that are sustainable for the future, but of course are much less predictable. You need the wind to be blowing to get wind power. You need the sun to be shining to get solar power. And if somebody was telling me the other day, of course, you know, if those two things aren't happening, you run the risk of having too little electricity. If those two things are happening simultaneously, you actually run the risk of having too much electricity, which is as much a problem as anything else. And so how do we evolve the electricity grid to be able to cope with these two twin simultaneous transformational events, this step change in demand with this complete change in the way that electricity is generated and supplied? Clearly, the grid needs to evolve. The grid needs to become smarter. It needs to become more interactive. It needs to become more and more better at self-healing and self-balancing. And so to explore this phenomena, explore this evolution of the smart grid is what we're going to be doing this afternoon. I'm super excited. We've got a really interesting panel with some brilliant experts from the industry, chaired by one of the smartest people on this subject that I certainly know, who I'll be introducing in a moment. So this channel will be exploring this particular topic, and it will be chaired by Yanis Parakis. I'll invite Yanis to join me in a moment. So Yanis is a principal in BP's Innovation and Engineering organization. He's focused on the emerging digital technologies accelerating this energy transition. He leads inside of BP, the Center of Expertise for Blockchain and Trust Engineering. And there he is. And prior to that, he was a senior associate at EY's Technology Consulting, and he worked in a number of different startups. And he's going to be chairing this panel today. So welcome to the panel, Yanis.
Hey, Tom, and hi, everyone.
Brilliant. So I think that's everything I had to say. Thank you. I hope you all enjoy this, and I will leave you in Yanis's capable hands to introduce the panelists.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the panel. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks to the broader Launchpad team for hosting us. Really happy to be here today with what we think is a very topical and a very exciting domain. I think as our panelists are joining, and as Tom touched on to some degree, the reason why we think this topic is exciting is not just because there's a massive amount of technological change on the grid, but also because energy and by extension, the energy grid is a fundamental part of all of our lives. In a way, the energy grid and energy touches all of us, and that technological innovation, in order to get better outcomes, ultimately needs to work for this diverse set of stakeholders. And how do we do that is still a pretty big and pretty unsolved question. So with me to step through this, and I'll introduce them in the order as they come up, we have Antonella Battaglini, Chris Elliott, and John McDonald. So Antonella Battaglini is the CEO of the Renewables Grid Initiative, the RGI, which she founded in 2009. And the RGI is a pretty unique collaboration between NGOs, but also TSOs, so transmission system operators from across Europe, promoting transparent, environmentally sensitive grid development in order to grow renewable energy and the energy transition. And Antonella is also bringing a lot of policy experience at the European level because she's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Clean Electrification, and she's also part of the European Commission's Interconnection Target Group. So we hope that she can bring in that policy experience. We also have with us Chris Elliott, who has just joined. Hey, Chris, good to see you. Chris is a co-founder and CFO of Pure Planet. And for those of you in the UK, you may know of Pure Planet. So along with his co-founders, Andrew Ralston and Stephen Day, and the backing of BP, Chris helped establish Pure Planet as a digital, sustainably focused domestic energy supplier in the UK. Over the past 4 years, Pure Planet has grown to supply almost 250,000 members in the UK. So they have a very vibrant, energetic community. And they're also quite focused to doing that while building their credentials internally as a business. So they're quite award-winning, not just for the customer service, but they also have a highly motivated and high enthusiastic team of people working for them. In 2021, they were voted the best utility in the UK to work for according to Best Companies, and also third in Best Companies to work for overall for medium-sized businesses in the UK. I see that our team is sorting out our access for some of our other panelists. So maybe I'll just start with you, Chris, while we're doing that. And maybe just ask you, moving beyond the impressive introduction, and just to get us warmed up. So could you talk a bit around what got you excited about the energy industry in the first place? Enough to make a career out of it. And I know you also have a background in telcos. So maybe touch a bit on what made you leave that industry where there's a lot of technological change happening as well, and come into the energy space.
Of course, yeah. So thank you for having me on the panel as well. Yeah, actually, it was from telecoms that I and kind of via the smart grid that I got interested in energy. Back a number of years ago, I was working in the city as an equity analyst, looking at telecom companies across Europe, and you know, what. I then moved off away from doing the equity research, and at that time I was really interested in what ultimately I could see potentially happening, which was this sort of coming together of communications infrastructure and electrical grid infrastructure in order to improve and smarten up, as they say, the grid and develop a smart grid. And that was an area that I was really interested in, sort of brought me into the energy area. It's also while I was in telecoms and telecoms research that I got to meet my other two co-founders, Andrew and Stephen, both of whom were part of the founding group of people for Virgin Mobile here in the UK. And I know that when I had been speaking with Stephen about my interest in energy and the smart grid specifically, just after they'd moved on from Virgin to run Orange in the UK and develop that into EE, and then subsequently they'd moved away from that and were looking for let's say what the next opportunity might be. One of the key things that they felt they managed to be able to help facilitate in telecoms was very much a move of technology, where technology was disrupting the services that were available for consumers. And Andrew specifically was looking around for where the next opportunity might be, and he was really drawn to the energy market. You know, here we're talking sort of 2012, 2013 time, and thinking that there were other ways in which we might be able to address the energy market from a consumer's perspective. And that's how I got introduced to Andrew through Stephen, and how we then developed the idea of Pure Planet, which really has been an idea which we have focused on, I guess, three things really from the start: for it being sustainable, for it being shared, and for it being smart. And those the sort of three core watchwords that we have within Pure Planet, and we can expand on a bit more of that in some time. But it was that's my sort of transition from telcos through into energy.
Yeah, and I think great point there about those three things, and we can discuss a bit and touch on, is this really a trilemma, or can you have all three things at once? But thank you for that, Chris. Yeah. I think John joined us as well. Hey, John, welcome to the panel. Really good to see you. We're just going through a bit of an introduction and a warm-up, so great to have you here. For everyone on the audience that's watching us, John McDonald is a smart grid business development leader for GE's Grid Solutions business, and John is gracing us here with 47 years of experience in the utility transmission and distribution industry. He's also an IEEE Life Fellow and very active academically. So he teaches around smart grid technologies and courses at the Georgia Institute of Technology, at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and at GE themselves. And he's published over 150 papers and articles around these topics. I think also it's worth mentioning that John is based in the US. So we have Antonella from Europe, Chris from the UK, and John from the US, and he has pretty broad consulting experience, so it will be great to bring in that global perspective as well. So welcome, John, and great that you could have you join us. The question that Chris was just answering, and maybe you can start us off with that from your perspective, is what got him excited about energy enough to make a long career out of it, in his case enough to also build a company around the space that's very award-winning in the UK. So would you like to tell us a bit about that from your perspective? You've been into this industry coming to half a century now. So what got you excited in the first place, and also what kept you there all of this time?
No, that's a really good question, Yanis. And what's interesting for me is I wanted to always be an electrical engineer. And then when I was at Purdue University as an undergraduate, a well-known professor who just had written the first book in the industry in 1968 on how to use a digital computer to model the power system. He took me under his wing and said, he looked at me in his office and he said, "John, you will be a power engineer." And I had no choice. So that was my whole career in his office. My whole curriculum was in power and energy. He told me I had to join the IEEE and get involved in IEEE, which this is my 50th year active in IEEE. So my whole career was power and energy from this professor. My whole curriculum was power and energy courses, and my specialty has been the automation of the grid. So Chris talked about, intelligence. I've worked 47 years now in adding intelligence to grid. So instead of a smart grid, I like to call it a smarter grid, because many of us, we've been adding intelligence to grid for a long, long time. The question is, what are we doing today that's different than what we've done 20 or 30 years ago? But I think what's exciting for me is, the question is, are we undergoing an evolution? Yanis, you said evolution, or is it truly a revolution? And when I think back 30 years, 40 years, what we were doing to the grid, I thought those changes were revolutionary at the time. And when I look at them now, they were really small. They were very incremental changes. Truthfully, what we're doing now is a revolution, much more than an evolution. The changes are happening more quickly. Technology is changing more quickly. And it's just hard to keep up. But what's exciting is the potential benefits, and we always say that if Thomas Edison, came back and looked at the grid today, a lot of it would be familiar to him because it hasn't changed too much in 100 years. If Marconi, if Alexander Graham Bell and some of the communications folks looked at communications today, they wouldn't recognize it with smartphones. So we really haven't progressed as quickly, with the grid as we have in, say, telecommunications, what Chris was talking about. But the one thing that the nexus of communications and smart grid, I always say we need to have a strong grid before we think about smart grid. Strong grid before smart grid. And we need to have a strong communications infrastructure and IT infrastructure to support all the new things that we're adding to the grid. And what we find is many people, they get excited about the new things and they start adding these new things, but they don't have the strong foundation in place. And then they don't get the performance of the new things that they're adding. So really have to take it step by step and make sure there's a foundation first. But I'll be 70 in December. I love what I do. I have no plans to retire. And truthfully, what we're doing now is so exciting. I would never think about wanting to retire. It's more fun now than it was, earlier in my career.
Yeah, and great answer, and love the energy, John. So maybe just building on that one as we step through the conversation. So Chris, I think what John touched on, and just paraphrasing it, John, there, that it seems like in this century we're not talking about an incremental evolution, but more of a revolution or more of fundamental change. So looking at that from your perspective, what would you say are the key drivers of that change? I mean, there's been things that's been happening in the space, as you said, John, for over 100 years, right? But what's different about this century, or is it this decade, that is driving that change, and also the speed of change that John touched on?
Yeah, I think, well, so from my perspective, probably picking up a bit on what Tom mentioned at the beginning, which is obviously a clear drive towards electrification and electricity being, an increasingly important energy vector for countries and the globe as we seek to move to an energy delivery system which is that much more sustainable. And it can deliver on or be able to deliver the requirements that we have, which are only, I suspect, if we're going to increase the amount of electricity that we need, the demand for electricity is clearly going to increase as we switch current energy uses into electricity. So we're going to see that, and I think that combining that with perhaps the technical ability that we have now, the ability to be able to handle so much more adeptly the volumes of data that can actually in the sort of time frame and manipulate that data in the kind of time frame which would enable perhaps some of the efficiencies to be delivered across the grid that really, you know, even up until 5 years ago would have been more wishful thinking than actually practical thinking. So I think I would argue that combination, and I would certainly concede John's point. I think it's very valid that the strength of the grid is going to be a key component, and you know it is vital. And we, as a supplier predominantly to domestic customers across the UK, you know, we have very stringent requirements on us to be able to ensure that people, you know, either don't go off supply, or if they do go off supply, then we need to be able to ensure that we can respond quickly to that situation, because there's clearly a number of people, especially vulnerable customers, who rely on that energy being available. So I completely understand and would agree with John's point about ensuring the strength of the grid. But at the same time, I think that the strength of the communications and some of the abilities that we have now with data is increasingly improving, and we are starting to be able to rely on that more and more for let's say critical services, and as a result that gives the opportunity then to start thinking about the efficiencies that might be possible across the grid if we're able to combine those two.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. And Antonella, welcome as well. I see you're able to join us. So great to see you live as well. We're talking about the drivers of change for the energy grid, and John was talking about how in some ways it's about the grid not becoming smart but smarter, and that what has been an evolution over a number of years is starting to feel now more like an evolution, and some of what Chris touched on are the drivers of that change. But maybe passing that over to you then, you have quite a broad European and a policy experience. So could you touch on a bit on if these are some of these drivers for change, so things like electrification, the need for sustainability and greater participation? Do you see any challenges or any constraints to how the energy grid is likely to evolve? So is there anything stopping us from doing all of these wonderful things that we're talking about here? A more digital, a greener, a smarter grid?
Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation. First of all, I must say that we're asking the wrong questions. Because we are talking about the grid as it is a piece disconnected from all the rest. It's not. It is an integral part of the system, and we only can talk about a smart grid if we talk about a smart energy system. So this is my first point. And I actually think that if we want to see a much faster deployment of reliable renewables, because this is what the transition is about, we need to understand how these renewables can be integrated in the grid at all voltage levels, and how the different actors interact to actually provide the flexibility that the grid needs to function well. So I'm always a bit concerned when people talk about smart grids, because you can ask 100 people what is a smart grid, and you will have 100 different answers of what a smart grid is. So maybe we should talk what is a smart system. And a smart system for me is a system which optimizes all the resources that we have available. And these include not only the energy resources, but also the environmental resources where energy infrastructure is being deployed, the economic resources that allow for the deployment, and the space, because at the end of the day, whenever we talk about grids, whenever we talk about energy infrastructure, we also require space. So a smart grid and a smart system is one that is planned in an integrated way, right from the beginning, taking into account all the different constraints, either technological, sociological, environmental, and economic. And this is the trend that we should follow. I think at European level, we have a very clear science or very clear determination to scale up renewables. The 50 for 55 package is under discussion right now. This will lead to increasing renewable targets, but at the same time, there is a clear objective to preserve, conserve, and restore biodiversity. We have a biodiversity strategy in place. And of course, there is also a very strong ambition for a just transition. So all the societal elements. And we need to be able to open up our mind to bring all the different elements together. And today, it seems to me that a lot of energy actors are still very much focusing on one silos and still struggling to combine all the different opportunities, because at the end of the day, solutions can only be found in the complexity of these sometimes competing and contradictory targets.
Yeah.
I think I was.
And it's a fair challenge. So how do we think about this in the context of a broader system and not siloed? But I think what you said, especially there in the end around this inclusion and societal elements, is maybe something we can build on. Because Chris, as we said on the introduction, looking at this from the perspective of a digital utility and having a community of 250,000 engaged members, do they care about where their electricity comes from? Should they? I mean, how do you see and how do they see maybe their role into this type of energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. There's no doubt that we have, as you mentioned, we have about we have about a quarter of our members are active on our community, and I think we've probably got one of the most active, if not the most active, sort of energy supply communities in the UK. And there's no doubt that our members are really interested in, or some of our members are really interested in where their energy comes from, and they're very keen to participate in what ultimately we all see as the energy transformation. But equally, there's a danger that there's a slight bit of self-selecting going on there. Of course, the people who are engaged and are interested in it are more likely to have joined our community. And there is a challenge, I think, for all of us in the energy sector as a whole to really engage. We try to do that. That's one of the rationales for having our community, was because we wanted to be able to engage with our members, not only about how much they have to pay for their electricity and gas, but also around what can be done to try and mitigate their footprints, what can be done in order to try and help the transition that all of us are looking to try and deliver over the course of the next 30 years or so. And with some customers as a whole, I think that's going to be a challenge. And I think one of the challenges we have as a supplier is communicating that effectively, but not trying to over communicate it. So actually trying to strike the right balance, because ultimately we need to send our members a bill every month, and we need to communicate with them when there are service issues that need to be done. So there's a real tightrope to be walked there in terms of over communicating, but or under under communicating and under delivering on effectively our responsibility on that front. I mean, I would say if you look in our community, one of the key things actually, and this is probably an interesting parallel to draw from telecoms, is how not just our community, sorry, but also across the sector, the level of engagement that you get from customers and our members around electric vehicles is really high. Now, there may be a bit of self-selection going on there, because you've got people who are who are a bit of aficionado on electric vehicles, and they want to discuss everything about their new Fiat 500e that they've just got. But actually, the parallel I would draw from telecoms is, as we saw 3G coming in the sort of late 90s, early noughties, and you started to see smartphones develop, and phones with that connectivity being developed, and providing that extra, interesting bit of technology in people's hands. That's when we really started to see a real pickup and a real consumer engagement in what previously probably had a little bit of a similar sort of profile to utilities back in prior to mobile phones really taking hold, where it was BT in the UK's case, and it was a telephone bill that you tried to keep as low as possible, and you tried not to use the phone too much, and you had to interact with a large organization if you wanted to change anything. Whereas that was a real shift, and as you saw that shift, so you saw a real pickup in engagement and a real development in interest in it. And I think we have the opportunity, and I think probably unashamedly, to sort of use the potential shift away from ICE vehicles into electric vehicles to drive that engagement, and actually use that as an opportunity for us to help everyone's understanding around the energy transition.
Yeah, I understand. So I think you touched on there a bit around engagement, I think, as well, and how that's evolving. Although I think, as you described it, it tends to be fragmented, right? It's not that everyone is necessarily engaged. People are at different stages. So maybe we'll come back to that, and how do you manage that as a utility, right? In that very diverse portfolio. But John, I see you were able to log back in again, so great for that. What we've been talking about is really what's the role of the different stakeholders into this transition of the energy grid. And I have to say, and just thinking of the challenge that Antonella put previously, I think on the whole, to me, it sounds like we're painting a, generally speaking, positive or net positive picture, right? So lots of exciting change happening. Not everyone is clearly engaged, but a respectable proportion of people are. Antonella touched on the things that are happening at the policy level, at least at the European level around that. But if you turn this around, and touching on your point earlier around reliability, this year we saw how bad things can get when the grid is not reliable. We saw that in Texas with the cold snap. Last year we saw that in California with the heat wave. So really, I guess my question is, do you see this as isolated phenomena? Clearly, you look at this quite broadly and quite globally, right? And do you expect things to see more of this? Do you expect things to get a lot worse before they get better, and these smarter technologies really kind of save that peak, if it is a peak of this phenomena that we're starting to see?
Well, the one thing that, it's a very conservative industry, to spend money, it has to be very, very, very much justified. It's very conservative. And unfortunately, with the industry over the years, it takes something like what happened in Texas, or it takes a severe blackout to get people's attention sometimes to spend money. For instance, unfortunately, what's happening is we're having 100-year storms, 2 of these in 10 years. When they should just be every 100 years. If you look at the number of extreme weather events, it's a positive slope. You know, we're having many more extreme weather events than we've ever had in the past. And that's why there's much more focus on resiliency of the grid. Resiliency. When we design things for the architecture of the grid, we concern ourselves with reliability and redundancy. But when the grid is stressed, like with extreme weather event, that's the resiliency of the grid. You know, we see how well it withstands the stress. So what we're learning now is we have to do a better job, right? With the designs, the architecture, redundancy of the grid, because we can't say that a 100-year storm will only happen every 100 years. That's not true. We have to spend the money. You know, in Texas, for instance, they had an ice storm, or they had a severe Arctic storm in 2011, and they learned from that in terms of plans. But unfortunately, the spending to implement those plans wasn't done. You know what happens is engineers can do the planning, but then policy people and politicians have to implement the spending. Okay, and sometimes their priorities are different than say the engineers. Okay, so they learned the hard way recently in Texas that they needed to winterize their grid much better.
Yeah, and maybe just building on that, and clearly investment is going to be a big part of the story. I think, Chris, you mentioned technology change in the telco world, right? And there we are also talking about grids of a different kind, or networks rather of a different kind, and heavy capex investment. So just thinking about the topic for this space then, is part of this kind of smarter technologies part of lowering the investment that's necessary for these big, complicated industrial systems ultimately? And is there a part of that touches on the consumer side? Because what we've also seen is pilots around decentralization, for example, or things like peer-to-peer energy type of models. Do you think these have a role to play, and do you see them scaling? Or are we still too early for that? And we are more of the interesting technologies, but you cannot really rely to them materially at the grid level.
Yeah, I would say from the consumer side, of course, we're right at the beginning of being able to do that, and the opportunity to start thinking about we need to see a greater penetration of electric vehicles, of course, to be able to start thinking about sort of vehicle to grid type solutions, and equally solar and battery installations. A pretty low number in total, I think, across the UK at the moment, and those would need to start to build to some scale to be able to actually genuinely have an impact. Although obviously trials are starting to begin on that sort of thing, and that's something that we're very keen to start doing as well. But I think once there is the opportunity to engage consumers around this and start to bring them on that journey, and as I say, almost unashamedly, we can use the sort of greater level of interest that there will be inevitably around something like an electric vehicle than there is around just supplying electricity and gas to your home, and potentially with smart meters being able to provide that additional level of visibility on what's going on with your energy use. That all has the opportunity to engage customers, so that there is that would be seeding really the understanding throughout the energy consumption market, let's say, that technology advances are beginning to occur and need to be invested in order to continue to develop it. Kind of, as John was saying, I could well see similar sorts of plans being made in the UK for one-off events, which equally then also come up against the capital constraints that inevitably hit businesses especially listed businesses that might be, that have shareholders to answer to as well. But I think what we do need to see is perhaps quite a concerted focus from policymakers, and again, I think John touched on this as well, from policymakers and politicians. It's easy to get the sound bites, and it's easy. We've got COP26 happening here in the UK later on this year, and it's very easy to sort of talk some nice headlines. What we need to see is some real action behind that, and as Antonella actually touched on earlier, coordinated action behind that, because without that coordinated action, there's a real danger that the businesses that have the opportunity to do this don't have the business case also to be able to do this. And I think that that's going to be a key element to driving improvements.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a bit of a leitmotif, that kind of broader systems thinking that Antonella touched on. But maybe John, turning then back to you, and I have maybe one more question after this, and we have a couple of interesting questions coming from the audience. Maybe we can try and pick off some of those. But looking back on your broad experience in this space, we've touched on the electrification of mobility. We've touched around on kind of digitalization to some degree. If you look forward, and whether that's 10 years or even longer in the future, is there anything around the energy grid that we shouldn't be talking about and we aren't? So, if you were to find yourself 10 years in the future almost, or even longer, do you think there would be a surprising or an unexpected thing that we would see that we're not really talking about in the way that, everyone talks about EVs, for example, today? Do you see anything like that a bit beyond the horizon?
I think there's a couple things, and we actually, in the United States, I was one of 11 smart grid experts chosen by the U.S. government, and we actually prepared a document that was published earlier this year on the future requirements of smart grid looking out 10 or 15 years. And the idea of that was what research needs to be done, what spending needs to be done, and what do we think we will see in 10 or 15 years? What should be the communications infrastructure to support that functionality, So that's a public document that's published by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, on their website. But I would say a couple things, Yanis. One would be, one of the revolutions today is really we call it the journey to digital transformation. Electric utilities are looking at digitizing their entire grid, and this requires greater it's intelligent machines with big data and analytics, and connecting it with people no matter where the people are. So it's much greater connectivity, okay, which requires communications. It's communications infrastructure that we've never seen before. Instead of top to bottom, most of the communications historically has been from the control center down to the field and back. Now it's peer-to-peer, because we want to distribute the intelligence down to the substation and down to the edge of the grid. And we want decision making at those points. So it's peer-to-peer, substation to substation, and grid edge controller to grid edge controller. We've never done this before. Okay. The second thing would be we're hiring data scientists, which we've never done before, and electric utilities are hiring data scientists. And we finished a book a couple of years ago called Big Data Application in Power Systems. And I wrote the first chapter, A Holistic Approach to Becoming a Data-Driven Utility. And this is the future, is everything's going to be driven by data. And so what's neat to me is we hire data scientists, teach them about the grid, and they give us new perspectives on how we can apply data science to do a better job with the electric grid. So I would say the big focus today, which we're just getting into now, is moving from reactive, where we waited till something failed, and then we reacted. Now we're at predictive. So we're trying to figure out what health information do we need about a transformer or about a circuit breaker to predict the failure modes. We don't want to wait till it fails and react. We want to prevent it from failing. But what's neat about this is we're only halfway up the journey, the curve. And we're using more artificial intelligence than we did before, machine learning, and this concept of a digital twin, of bringing physics together with health information and simulating power system components. And eventually, the goal is to be autonomous, okay, which is much less human interaction and much more self-healing, much more happening on its own. So I would say the future grid is going to be very different than today. You're going to see much more digitization. You're going to see new technologies to handle the intermittency of renewables. You know, you want your lights at home to be on when the wind's not blowing and when the sun's behind the clouds. How do we deal with that? And so we have new technologies being offered all the time. For instance, a combination of 10 megawatts of lithium-ion batteries with a 50 megawatt fast start, fast responding natural gas-fired turbine generator, and an electronic gas hybrid turbine package with software to optimize the integrated operation. So you have the best of both worlds, instantaneous support for frequency with the batteries, a longer term support with a turbine generator. So we're seeing more technologies like that because the penetration of renewables is growing, you know, and we have to deal with the intermittency. So that's just, there's a number of examples, but that's just a couple.
Yeah, and thank you, John. And sorry, come on, Chris.
I was just going to say, I think that's. I mean, it's really enthusing and encouraging to hear what you're saying, John, as well, because I just think being able to get you know, as all industries sort of can have the danger of getting stuck in a rut, and you know, and I have to say the energy industry is one where there is a level of complexity, which means that a lot of people spend a lot of time getting narrower and narrower and narrower in their focus. And the ability to sort of take your head up and look around is often precluded for many people. So the sense that there are people who are genuinely out there looking around and thinking, you know, how do we make these how do we make our networks more reliable? You know, I wonder whether a really interesting thing would be to draw a parallel perhaps from someone like Netflix, who's where Netflix is basically ensuring that it knows roughly what content is going to be wanted where across its global network, and is delivering those into local servers. You know, there's a potential parallel there maybe with the grid to say, okay, actually we know, you know, we can learn, and the artificial intelligence can start to learn where the issues may arise and try to anticipate them, as you said, John, you know, become proactive. So knowing that there are people out there looking across you know, a wide range of disciplines, is, I think, hugely encouraging. And I would say, you know, that it's the way, you know, it's kind of the way a number of industries, I think, are having to evolve as to look at a broader spectrum and get the best from a number of areas. So really encouraging to hear. Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you both. I should say that apologies, but Antonella had some technical difficulties, so she struggled to join us. As you said, as you saw, rather, she did make quite a heroic effort to join us while she was on the move, but we haven't completely fixed that technological challenge yet. So maybe I'll move on to some of the questions that we've been getting from the audience. We have about 10 minutes to go, so I'll try and pick those off as they've come up. We did have a question that I think, John, you already touched on, around what is the role of artificial intelligence and in related technologies in terms of forecasting demand at the edge, and I guess more broadly in the type of smarter kind of data science-led designs that we're seeing. So I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to touch on there, and also maybe just because you've touched on it already, there's a question from Robin Yellow as well, which is, are we putting too much trust, I suppose, in an autonomous grid? So do you see a risk at the other side of that? There's clearly benefits, and you've touched on them. Are there any downsides into this more automated utopia, if it is any utopia that we're describing?
No, those are good questions. I would say with artificial intelligence, what we look at is, where are the strongest business cases You know, I think Antonella talked about the smart grid is part of smart energy, right? It's something bigger. And we always say, don't just look at the microprocessor-based device, but that has two-way communications. And we teach students and young professionals always think of the big picture, the holistic solution, okay? And so with artificial intelligence, the question is, where are the strongest business cases for the holistic solutions with artificial intelligence applications? And today they're in two areas. Optimizing the distribution part of the grid. And the reason for that is, you know, for my 47-year career, most of the spending, the higher priority spending for utility was generation transmission. Distribution was the tail of the dog. You know, it was lucky they had to fight for a component on a distribution feeder where generation's building power plants, transmission's building lines. So distribution hasn't had the investment. And then, so that's one area. The other area is asset optimization, what we talked about with transformers. That's the most critical. And then high voltage and medium voltage circuit breakers. So this person, if they go on the internet, they can find, you know, I have some recent papers that were done for conferences, artificial intelligence applications for what we call asset management. You know, what we talked about with moving from reactive to predictive, you know, not waiting for a transformer to have a fire and explosion, but we can detect up to 9 different gases that are dissolved in the oil of the main tank of the transformer. And like if I see methane, I know exactly what's failing in the transformer. If I see ethylene, if I see acetylene, these tell me specifically what's happening. And then I look at the rate of change, okay? And I see, well, how quickly is this deteriorating? So we have a lot of intelligence today. We're using artificial intelligence here. And the reason is it's a strong business case. You have a very critical asset. It's very expensive, and you want to prevent it from failing. So, you know, like with anything else, we apply the new technology to those things that have the strongest payback, where we have the strongest business cases first.
And do you see any risk at the other side of that from those technologies?
That's a good question, because I was going to say earlier, when you're at the university, you're a professional, and you're just so busy with your work, and you say, this is so hard developing this product. And I say, that's the easy part. The hardest part is convincing a customer to do what they've been doing for 20 years differently to adopt your new product, okay? I took 2 psychology courses as electives as an undergraduate and electrical engineer, and they've helped me. You have to understand people, what drives people. So to me, you know, we're not allowed, truthfully, to put logic on the grid and close a loop on it until it's been so tested because of the conservative nature of the industry and the potential risk that if it does fail, you know, lights could go out, right? So really the concern about risk, it's not there, because it's such a conservative industry, and it's so difficult to get a customer to adopt new technology, particularly if you're closing the loop on it and taking the human out of the loop. That's not a concern I've ever had, and I've worked for 4 different automation system suppliers, and that's never been a concern, because things are so well tested that when it is implemented and the switch is closed, you know exactly what's going to happen. You have confidence in it. Yeah.
Good. And maybe just picking one more question. I think we have about 5 minutes to go, and we should give Tom a couple of minutes to round us off. But so Chris, maybe coming to you for the last one. Then there's a question from Johan Vermins, and apologies if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong there. Around, I think that the crux of the question is, how realistic is it to think that renewables, touching on the sustainability side of this conversation, so solar, wind, and others, can replace fossil fuels in terms of the energy grid? And I think I guess that must be a question that in the UK context, at least you're thinking about from Pure Planet as well, because you've set yourselves up from the beginning with that principle stance that I guess the clue is in the name, right? That Pure Planet is a green utility. So do you think that there's a future where this is all renewable energy, and what does it take to maybe get there from that utility perspective?
Yeah, and I guess that's the 64 billion, or pick your figure question, which everybody is wrestling with. Look, I think fundamentally, if there's one thing that that we've seen over the course of the last 12 or 18 months, it is a sort of reinvigoration of the ingenuity of us as humans, to be able to take challenges on, big challenges, and we have another big challenge. It's a bit of a slower burn in terms of climate change that we want to try and resolve, and I think with that comes the opportunity to try and work in ways in which we might be able to resolve the intermittency and the distributed nature of renewables in such a way that we can start to rely almost exclusively on renewables over time. It's going to take a long time. There's a transition that will be required rather, but I think fundamentally, the combination of more innovation around storage ultimately, which is going to be required, and whether that's sort of battery style storage, or whether it becomes green hydrogen type storage, the way in which we evolve towards that, I think given a problem, a lot of John's colleagues, I think, are able to resolve those sorts of problems over time. And I think the point that you made earlier on, and asking how we get into the almost the public psyche, a greater awareness of what needs to be done in order to achieve that goal, the more we can do to build that understanding and the rationale, so the more we as a society have the opportunity to shift towards recognizing the problem and recognizing how we might deliver solutions. So I haven't given you a silver bullet there, I recognize that clearly, but I think there is an opportunity for us to be able to shift significantly towards that. Whether carbon capture and storage has to play a part in that that may well be the case, certainly through the transition, but yes, I look forward to hopefully seeing maybe a position where we can see full renewables, and I think trying to help drive the demand for that as well is a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. And I think, as Antonella noted earlier, a lot of this may be around systems thinking as well, right? We had some questions and some comments around that as well, that we're talking about a smarter grid here, but there is also smarter cities and this kind of smart mobility systems, these broader systems that ultimately are all still powered by energy, though. So this transition and accelerating this transition is something that needs to happen across all verticals, which is what makes it such a diverse and I guess energizing problem to work on, as you've mentioned, John. And in many ways, as you said in your intro, maybe the most exciting stuff is actually what's ahead of us rather than what's behind us. So I'll stop here. We're right about on time. I'd like to thank again John McDonald from GE, Chris Alliott from Pure Planet, and also Antonella from the Renewable Grid Initiative that unfortunately had a bit of technical difficulty. And thank you, of course, to our audience for our questions. I know we didn't get a chance to pick all of them off, but we do have an after event, so maybe we can touch on some of these questions there. And Tom, if you are still there, I'll pass back to you. Thank you for hosting us from the panel.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I think, from systems thinking to energy systems to reactive to predictive, you know, and even CDNs for energy, I think, Chris. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all. Thank you as panelists. Thank you, Yanis. Thank you, everybody who's attended. There will be a copy of the recording of this on YouTube for people to watch later. But with that, thank you all very much for attending, and goodbye. And please do stay for the after event networking as well. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.